It may seem weird to say, but Paw Patrol is a video game franchise. It's 4 games strong, not counting the spin-off kart racer, and as with most franchises, every new entry iterates on the previous. In this video, we'll be looking at the games in order, and piecing together how they've progressed over time. We'll see what's changed, what hasn't, and what components are absolutely essential to the brand's interactive identity. Here we go. Paw Patrol On a Roll is the first Paw Patrol platformer, and it sets the foundation for future titles in the series. It introduces pup treat collecting, badge collecting, mini-games, on-rails runner segments, and the general flow of level design. For better or worse, the mechanics established here are utilized in nearly every sequel. As to On a Roll itself, well, it's fairly mediocre. The game is incredibly workmanlike, being almost entirely function over form. It's polished, responsive, and colorful, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anything particularly passionate or artistically potent here. It also overstays its welcome in a big way, featuring 16 total missions, which is double the length of future entries in the franchise. Also, its choice in genre and game design is fairly questionable, to say the least. It's not as though the pups are crazy for treats in the show, so turning the license into a 2D collectathon centered around hoarding vast amounts of food is weird, but it was probably just the simplest way to go about things, path of least resistance and all that. Everyone knows what a 2D platformer is, everyone knows about collecting shiny stuff in games, so it's a platformer collectathon now. Either way, these tropes carry forward to the next game pretty much wholesale. Mighty Pups is the second entry in the Paw Patrol franchise. It is a platformer like its predecessor, but this time in 3D, and it's a massive improvement. This game ups the presentation, level variety, level design, collectible placement, and features far more entertaining and energetic minigames. Of the entire franchise, this game feels like the most joyful, earnest, and creative. It's just a good game without qualification. It's very respectful of its target demographics intelligence, featuring notable artistic flourish and intelligent usage of its fairly limited mechanics. You do still run around collecting a horde of pup treats for some reason, and a couple of the minigames are plainly unfair, but those complaints wither against Mighty Pup's overall immense quality. This game illustrates the proper potential of the series. Paw Patrol Adventure City Calls is the worst game in the franchise. It distills the mechanics, design, and tropes of its predecessors into a soulless linear grind. You just waddle down corridor after identical corridor, nabbing hundreds and hundreds of floating baubles without any visual or mechanical variety to stave off the tedium. There are no colorful locations, exciting animations, or clever twists this time around, and the all-around production value takes a nosedive. There are still some minigames and auto-runner sections, but they're brutally difficult thanks to some egregious pop-in, and they require far less interactivity than Mighty Pups. In general, Adventure City Calls feels like a prototype for Mighty Pups, not a sequel. It has less of everything about it is less polished, and there's no joy or spark of imagination. I would imagine this was primarily owed to a poor budget, but either way, the game is what it is, and it is dreadful. Paw Patrol World is presently the final game in the Paw Patrol franchise, and it's a huge departure from prior entries. This time the design is fully open world, but you'll still be collecting pup treats and badges and occasionally jumping, just like you used to. This time though, the majority focuses on simple interactions with environmental objects. There are cute animations littered everywhere in the open areas, and they all reward you with shiny collectibles. The game is effectively about locating and watching as many of these animations as possible, punctuated by some fetch quests and traditional exploration. That may sound awful, but it's actually pretty solid, thanks entirely to some gorgeous art assets and thoughtful level design. Exploring feels natural, and the charm of Paw Patrol's setting was successfully adapted into a functional open world. That said, it still feels somewhat cynical. It's hard to mechanically justify the switch from a traditional platformer to this more modern template, especially given the inclusion of predatory DLC. But if you're willing to put up with that corporate cash grubbery, this is by no means a bad game. My roommates actively took an interest in playing it with me too, so that has to count for something. Oftentimes, folks ask me why I review and analyze kids' media, and there are a ton of reasons, but most chiefly, it's important. This stuff we show kids shapes their minds and their expectations of the world around them. It teaches them about human culture and how that culture manifests through artistic and emotional avenues. Paw Patrol itself is a cultural phenomenon, and how we adapt it into the medium of games says a lot about what we think of games and what we want to communicate to kids. It's worth analyzing for the same reason it's worth analyzing the food we eat or the relationships we keep, and I find it all rather fascinating. And if there's a primary takeaway from the Paw Patrol game franchise, it's that we don't treat games with much respect. The first one was a middle-of-the-road 2D platformer because that's a common and simple genre to produce. Then future entries tried to expand on that template before ultimately switching to a modern open-world format. Regardless of the actual quality of the games, this is a pretty poor way to adapt the source material, and interactive media is capable of much greater. Hey, you made it. We're at the end of the video. I pretty much said everything I wanted to say in the conclusion/outro, so I'm just going to thank my lovely patrons for helping me make these videos in the first place. My Patreon is linked down in the description if you're curious. With that out of the way, I'd like to thank the following lovely supporters. I Pompous, Anonymous, Jay, Marth Sinclair, The Roses, Sam Anderson, Some Call Me Anto, Waposa, Mint Horse, Mike Hansen, Kay Storkson, Zuzu, Igor Oliveira, Hawthorne Bunny, and Folly Boyo. Thank you all so much for your time and thoughts, and I'll see you in the next video.